Coming up, Tucker Carlson interviews Minnesota independent journalist Liz Collin from Alpha News, and it's an absolute bombshell. We'll highlight two of the most explosive revelations from the landmark conversation and discuss the implications for both Minnesota and the United States. We'll also talk about the debate amongst conservatives over the 12-day war, as President Trump calls it, and explore what an America First foreign policy truly looks like. Finally, I'll highlight one of the bills I authored as a state representative here in Minnesota, which would push back against the abuses of civil asset forfeiture. And for ex-subscribers and YouTube channel members, look for today's edition of The Smoke-Filled Room, a supporter-exclusive bonus show which delves deeper into my personal perspectives and thoughts on culture and social issues. Welcome to the revival of Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.
4, 3, 2. Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.
Ever since discovering Rush Limbaugh as a teenager, I always wanted to be a conservative talk radio host. A few years ago, I got that opportunity when an evening slot opened up on Twin Cities News Talk AM 1130 in the Minneapolis market. For 3 years, I woke up early every weekday morning, worked a day job for 8 to 10 hours, did show prep for an hour or two, and then did 2 hours of radio in the evening. It was a passion project, a dream come true that didn't pay very well, but proved very fulfilling nonetheless. Since ending the program in 2019, just before the pandemic upended our way of life, I made the move into public service, first as a city council member and more recently as a state representative here in Minnesota. But I've always retained the heart of a commentator, and the time has come to take up that mantle once again here. Closing Argument is back, so buckle up and let's get to it. Tucker Carlson needs no introduction. His move from corporate media to developing an independent platform has generated tens of millions of views and developed a new center of gravity in the political conversation. Here in Minnesota, a similar development has arisen in the form of Alpha News, an independent media operation which counters the mainstream narrative by simply reporting the truth. The star reporter at Alpha News is Liz Collin, a decades-long reporter who previously worked for WCCO in Minneapolis before being drummed out of her job for the sin of being married to a Minneapolis police officer. Tucker recently had Liz Collin on his program to discuss a wide variety of topics, many of which are familiar to Minnesotans, but which may come as a shock to other Americans throughout the several states. They talked about George Floyd and the BLM riots from 2020. They talked about Governor Tim Walz and Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Liz recounted how she and her family were terrorized by unhinged left-wing insurgents in the wake of George Floyd's death. The entire interview is well worth the watch, but today I want to focus in on 3 clips which I found particularly explosive. Some of this I knew prior to watching the interview, but some of the details are new to me, and if they're new to me, someone holding political office with his ear to the ground, then they're probably new to you too. So let's take a look. First, listen as Liz relates how, while working for WCCO as a news anchor, she was required by parent company CBS News to uphold the false narrative surrounding both the death of George Floyd and the massively destructive riots which followed.
And even before George Floyd, you could see what the media was turning into. And that really bothered me on a moral and ethical level more than anything else. Into? Just not so much what we would tell the public anymore, but what we would not. How we would craft a story. I talk a lot about this in the book, but there were mandates after George Floyd that half of the people we interviewed had to be non-white or from a protected class. In the wake of
where did those mandates come from?
From what I understand, CBS News. You could not use the term riots at all in your reporting.
Actually?
Right. Just the way we would control the language and shape stories.
WCCO?
Correct.
Boy, I can't. When they do go bankrupt, will you text me just so I can celebrate? I really hope that they go under soon. That's so dishonest.
3 points emerge there. First, and I think most important, note that Liz talks about the impact of what is not reported. Now, as a state legislator, I can affirm that this is the biggest disservice that the mainstream media provides. There are so many redacted stories, lived experiences that prove inconvenient to the dominant political narrative and therefore never see the light of day in our political discourse. I see it every time I visit North Minneapolis, or sit down with leaders in the Somali community, or talk to teachers, administrators, school board members, and others who the Democrats claim as their exclusive constituency. The gap between how groups of people are portrayed within this intersectional critical theory framework and what they actually believe as individuals is vast. For instance, when the media wants to know what teachers think about education policy in the state of Minnesota, they're most likely to ask officials from the teachers' union, Education Minnesota, which eagerly parrots the partisan political talking points of Minnesota Democrats. But if you actually talk to real teachers on the ground, teachers in my district, teachers around the state of Minnesota, they'll tell you what they really need: flexible funding to support the local needs of local students, relief from the mandates imposed from St. Paul, the freedom to meet students where they live without the handcuffs of state agency policies. One of the most potent examples I can share came from a meeting I attended after the end of the regular legislative session this year, which was ironically put together by one of my Democrat colleagues on the Education Finance Committee, Representative Bianca Vernick. That meeting was focused on the issue of long-term facilities maintenance. Now, you're going to have to bear with me here because facilities maintenance probably sounds like a pretty boring topic, but there's an important observation here. In Minnesota, we have state funds that are distributed to school districts for the purpose of providing long-term facilities maintenance. But those funds are strictly regulated in terms of how they can be used and for what. So, for instance, one of the participants in this meeting, someone representing the Roseville School District, asked about replacing the public announcement system with something new. The problem is, the system they're looking to replace it with has updated features and modern capabilities that weren't available in the original system. And the way things are currently set up, long-term facilities maintenance dollars can't be spent on upgrades. You can only replace like for like. So imagine you're a school with an old boiler that was manufactured in the 1930s. It goes down and you need to replace it. But that model boiler isn't produced anymore because it's been almost 100 years. Well, too bad, so sad. You can't use long-term maintenance dollars to replace that boiler with something new. This is the level of absurdity currently plaguing Minnesota schools. And that's only one example in one category. Chances are, me here telling you this now is the first you've heard of that. Why? Because this is one of many redacted stories that the mainstream media in Minnesota will never tell you. And that raises the question, why won't they tell you? Well, Liz addresses that too.
I realize too that some of it seems like impossible to believe. But again, being trained as a reporter, I know how this works. You talk to people, you verify things, you source things, and I feel very confident always in all of our information. And that's what is always so frustrating to me, that this should be the front page of the Star Tribune basically every day. But instead, the Star Tribune is run by a former commissioner of Governor Walz. He's the CEO and publisher, and it's truly unbelievable, the stories they put out. It's just turned into pure propaganda.
The Star Tribune is run by a former Walz commissioner?
It is. Steve Groves was his commissioner for years, and I don't think this relationship actually exists anywhere in the country between a governor and a publisher of the largest newspaper, but somehow in Minnesota that's allowed.
And it's not just Steve Groves and the Star Tribune. As Liz detailed in her conversation with Tucker Carlson regarding her tenure at WCCO, the mainstream media seems entirely sold out to the Democrat Party establishment. So you can expect no curiosity or questioning of matters that might even potentially put the Democrats in a bad light, even if the impact of ignoring those stories proves detrimental to Minnesota students. The same is true of residents in places like North Minneapolis, whose stories only make the news if they affirm the Democrat political narrative. You won't hear on the local evening news testimonies like I encountered when I sat down to have dinner with leaders in the Somali community who told me that they support the police, that they want school choice so that they can transmit their values and culture to the next generation, and that they value economic freedom to support their entrepreneurial goals. Those stories are inconvenient for the state's current ruling regime and therefore redacted from the public discourse. Perhaps the biggest bombshell dropped by Liz Collin in her interview with Tucker Carlson were details relating to Governor Tim Walz's ties with Communist China. Now, it's human nature to doubt that someone among us, particularly in a position of leadership, could be a committed anti-American ideologue, allegiant to a ideology that's responsible for the deaths of between 50 to 100 million people. Communist regimes from the Soviet Union to Cuba and, of course, indeed, Communist China have killed 5 times as many people as the Nazis did. And yet, for some reason, we don't seem to have the same disdain for communism that we properly do for fascism. But these two ideologies, which are often fallaciously placed on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, are actually vile cousins related in tyranny and totalitarianism. Life under a fascist is fundamentally no different than life under a communist. Both subordinate the rights of the individual to the Nietzschean will of the state. Both demand that you abandon your personal beliefs and interests to serve those who rule. With that in mind, listen to these revelations from Liz Collin regarding the current governor of Minnesota, who the Democrat Party just got done running for vice president of the United States.
These ties to China, which I think are troubling.
What ties does he have to China?
Well, we know himself, he said that he's made more than 30 trips to China. He went there upon graduating.
30 trips to China?
Went there upon graduating.
That's a long flight. And he's spent his life as like a school teacher.
He's from Nebraska originally.
What is a school teacher from Nebraska doing making 30 trips to China?
And in the National Guard at the time as well, making these trips to China. We also know he started
But what's that? First of all, it's really expensive. It's time consuming. It's not something that happens. You don't go to China 30 times unless you have a real reason to do that. What would that reason be?
He was taking kids over there at one point as a travel agency. But what's interesting is
Who let their kids travel with Tim Walz?
I've spoken to a few of them that they're obviously older now. They were in their 20s when they would make these trips in college. One student in particular, it's very interesting. He said that he'd been trying to get the attention of the media about this guy for years. He said he would go there on these trips and collect the little red Mao book. He would buy as many as he could on these trips, saying that they were, souvenirs. Tim Walz would. And he said it was very apparent. He just had this, he adored communism and would talk about it in conversation. These students could pick up on that.
Are you serious?
And this student tried, even when he was running for Congress, to say there's more to this guy that you
Mao
guys
killed so many more people than Hitler that it's not even close.
Yes.
Not a defense of Hitler, who was evil.
Yeah.
But Mao is the greatest mass murderer in history.
He's also married. His wedding anniversary, they were married 5 years after Tiananmen Square, and he picked that date because it was a date that they would remember, he and his wife.
What?
Who does that?
Tiananmen Square?
Correct.
The tank crushing the lone protester? That's
their wedding anniversary. And they went to China for their honeymoon.
Come on.
But
I was in this country during that campaign. It was less than a year ago. I never heard anybody say that.
But again, you have in Minnesota what has happened. We have a new state flag.
Wait. Do you think... I'm sorry. I'm just mesmerized by this.
There's a lot of questions. I agree.
Questions?
Yeah. But the problem is there's not anybody looking for answers, it seems like.
Well, they want to kill themselves. So they're doing a great job. I get it. Ultimately, I just have to say this as a white man. I do blame the liberal whites. They want to kill themselves and their kids. That's what they're into. I don't know what you see it in Britain. So I'm not into suicide, so I'm opposed. But they're the ones doing this, and Walz is a perfect example. So, but why would you're sure he picked the anniversary?
They've talked about this in interviews. Yeah, this is in newspapers.
But Tiananmen Square was a massacre of peaceful protesters.
I know.
Do you think they picked it to in the memory of those brave souls who died opposing the machine?
They haven't said that.
my God.
And what's interesting is, again, we're focusing over at Alpha News on these stories. There's supposed to be a congressional hearing about all of this, and it's kind of just gone nowhere. Sadly, we also know, I've spoken to a couple people that served with Tim Walz in Nebraska in that guard unit, and they suspect, and we've done stories and tried to reach out to Walz for comment, but they suspect that perhaps he took their standard operating procedure, the SOP, for the howitzer army tank. He was assigned to this tank. It was nuclear capable, and this was all laid out in the SOP that goes missing while he's there. And
the manual goes missing?
Right, and they had talked to the FBI about this as well. There's so many questions.
What does that mean? Why did they talk to the FBI?
They think that he was traveling back and forth from China at this time, and then we also know that this howitzer...
Wait.
I know I sound crazy right now.
No, you don't sound crazy at all. You're recounting the facts.
Yeah.
You are saying that men he worked with in the National Guard in Nebraska went to the FBI because they believed he had given classified military secrets to the Chinese government?
They suspect that he did. And
well, they suspected to the point that they went to the FBI.
Well, this was all when all these stories are coming out finally about his background, and they're like, maybe we should talk about this. These are guys that back then didn't report this. This was in the early 90s, and they always talked about it amongst themselves. And I think that they weren't completely aware of, the potential threat something like this could pose, but they always thought this was very strange. And then China started producing almost a carbon copy of this military tank a couple years later.
Come on. For real?
According to all of our research.
Did the Minneapolis Star-Tribune break this story?
Oh, no. No. They haven't touched much of this. In fact, actually, when they reported it's Tim Walz goes to China with these kids, and it's this great travel company he started, I think it was a very small story even addressing this at all.
And he chose to be married on the 5th anniversary of a massacre of peaceful protesters. Oh, man, this is super dark.
To put this into context, we're talking about a governor who apparently, according to the latest polling, has a 50% plus approval rating in the state of Minnesota. Do those Minnesotans who say they approve of his performance know that he took 30 trips to China? That he bought Mao's Little Red Book to distribute back here at home? That he recently said China should be the chief negotiator between Iran and Israel? That he believes communist China presents the ideal model for governance? I don't think they do. Because in order for Minnesotans to know that, someone would have to tell them. And the mainstream media in this state is not interested in disclosing those facts. By contrast, imagine if there was a prominent Republican politician in the United States who was on the record expressing sympathy with Nazi propaganda, perhaps just commenting on how well the trains were run in Nazi Germany during the 1930s. The uproar would be off the charts and nonstop 24/7, and we all know it. Why would he give a pass to a guy who openly expresses sympathy with a homicidal and destructive ideology, which again resulted in 50 to 100 million deaths in the 20th century alone? Well, maybe for the same reason that we're barely batting an eye at an openly socialist mayoral candidate in New York City who wants to impose the same Soviet policies in the Big Apple, which led to breadlines in the USSR. The past couple of weeks have been utterly historic on the international stage. Israel launched preemptive attacks on Iran's nuclear program, and President Donald Trump landed the fatal blow with a devastating attack upon 3 key nuclear sites. For the time being, the result seems to be relative peace and security in the region. Israel has all but neutralized Iran's proxies in Gaza, Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and others. All this has unfolded amidst a fascinating debate among American conservatives, particularly those who lay claim to the MAGA brand. The debate has oscillated between 2 extremes: the isolationists on one hand and the warmongering neocons on the other. But Trump seems to have found the sensible middle ground. When we talk about America first, what do we mean? Well, some may argue that any foreign policy action which benefits another country like Israel is somehow a betrayal of that principle. But it's obviously possible for the interests of a foreign ally to be substantially aligned with our own interests. Iran is led by a regime that shamelessly and unapologetically chants death to America. We know they have proxies around the globe and likely have sleeper cells here in the United States. So allowing that regime to develop or acquire a nuclear weapon is obviously unacceptable. That said, there's a big difference between setting back Iran's nuclear program, which Trump seems to have effectively done, and committing to an endless war to effect regime change in Iran. I couldn't care less what regime rules Iran. It's none of my business. I only care whether they have the ability to harm me, my family, and my fellow countrymen at home or abroad. What Trump has done is precisely what an American president should do. Address the clear and present danger with swift and devastating force, minimize American losses, and push for peace. It's weird to me to see so much controversy around this because the root concerns from both the isolationists and the warmongers has effectively been addressed by Trump's response. We're not going into forever war, and we've effectively devastated Iran's nuclear ambitions. Trump hit the bullseye, and we should be grateful. Finally today, I want to highlight a bill I introduced this year in the Minnesota legislature. This is something I plan to do on a regular basis on this program, highlight legislation that I co-authored or authored. And when I run out of those, I'll talk about other bills that people have authored, whether I support them or not, just to give you an inside scoop on how the legislative process works and the kinds of ideas that are floating around at the Minnesota Capitol. So HF 3329 is a bill which I authored, which would require a public defender in a criminal case to also act as civil counsel in an effort to recover property seized through civil asset forfeiture. It would also stay that civil asset forfeiture case until the related criminal proceedings are resolved. So if you're unfamiliar, civil asset forfeiture is a process through which private property, such as a vehicle, can be seized by the state when the property owner is caught up in a criminal investigation. And what can happen is someone can be charged with a crime, have their property seized as part of this civil asset forfeiture process. And as we all know, being charged with a crime is not the same thing as being convicted. So you can have a situation, and there have been many, where a defendant is acquitted, but their property is still held by the state. And under current law, there's no obligation for the state to provide civil representation for that defendant in an effort to recover their property. So you could have a situation, and there have been, where someone is completely innocent, gets exonerated, but still loses a significant amount of property, like a vehicle, because they lack the resources to effectively navigate the civil legal process. So the idea behind this bill is that if we're going to say that someone is entitled to legal representation in criminal matters, we should ensure that they are also represented throughout the entire process, including relevant civil asset forfeiture. Now, this is a bipartisan bill. It's co-authored by my friend and colleague, Representative Sandra Feist, who I've worked with effectively on other pieces of legislation. This is one of those issues that truly does cross party lines, and so I'm hopeful that we may be able to advance it in the 2026 legislative session. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's it for today, unless you're an ex-subscriber or YouTube channel member, in which case you can look for my feed for today's edition of The Smoke-Filled Room, my support exclusive bonus, where I get a bit more personal and address cultural and social issues. In today's episode, I talk about my upbringing as a child in a repressive religious sect and how that experience impacts my political outlook today. Subscribe on X or join my channel as a member on YouTube to get access. Either way, look forward to another episode of Closing Argument with Walter Hudson each weekday moving forward. Take care.
Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.